Warning: Dvorkin's Totalitarian Sect. In previous articles, we examined in detail the process of destroying democracy and freedoms, using Nazi Germany as an example. A key role in this process was played by the methodology of dehumanizing victims and creating an enemy image for the masses. After all, Nazism cannot exist without an enemy and without war. These methods were passed on to the NSDAP by Walter Knuth's Apologetic Center, and as a direct result of their application, Nazism emerged with all its inhumane manifestations and atrocities. With the end of World War II, Knuth's student, Friedrich Wilhelm Hack, and his ideological follower, Johannes Agard, created an international network of apologetic centers called the Dialogue Center, which trained a whole generation of activists. These individuals, now operating under the guise of fighting cults, are in fact promoting Nazi ideology in many countries around the world. The most active and favored student of Hack and Agard was Alexander Dvorkin, who established the Dialogue Center in Russia, later renaming it the Center for Religious Studies in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, also known as RACIRS, Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects. Dvorkin is undoubtedly an outstanding follower of his Nazi mentors. He adopted their methods of mass manipulation and infiltrated the Russian Orthodox Church, ROC, much like Knuth organized his activities within the Lutheran Church of Germany. His mentor from the Orthodox Church in America, John Meyendorff, played a significant role in this, as Dvorkin studied under him during his emigration to the US in the 1980s. However, for Dvorkin, the ROC is merely a convenient organization to conceal his activities and ideology, which have nothing in common with Christian values. It is no coincidence that Patriarch Alexei II, who initially blessed the creation of the center, soon distanced himself from Dvorkin. For Dvorkin, the anti-cult movement, borrowed from the Nazis, became his primary tool for establishing total control and power. He often boasts about his so-called achievement, the term Totalitarian Sect, which he allegedly coined and introduced into common use. However, amid widespread criticism not only of Dvorkin's activities, but also of all his associates, there is also an opinion that he himself has created an organization that, by his own criteria, fits the definition of a sect, and in the worst sense of the word, a totalitarian, extremist, perverse, and destructive killer cult. For over 3 decades, he has been drawing a vast number of people into this sect. Using Dvorkin's own terminology, he recruits adherents not only from within religious circles, but even more actively from among government officials, law enforcement agencies, and journalists. As a result of Dvorkin's sect activity, countless lives have been shattered. His totalitarian sect has destroyed families, deprived children of their homes, stripped people not only of their freedom, but also of their lives, driving some to suicide. Here is a testimony from someone who attended one of Dvorkin's sectarian events. On Wednesday, March 19th, I accidentally found out about a meeting with the well-known sectologist A. Dvorkin that was taking place at NSTU, and I decided to attend. My first impression and surprise were that there were no calm faces in the hall. There were many young people, but their expressions were tense and somewhat distorted. The older attendees also had an unhealthy excitement on their faces. Arriving about 10 minutes late, Dvorkin began his talk by explaining how to rescue sect members from their sects. He detailed the technical aspects, where one could meet sect members and where one should not, what to talk about first and what to say later, and so on. His tone was businesslike, straightforward, and laced with humor. I didn't stay long at that meeting. Even from a purely formal standpoint, such logic is flawed and can be used for any purpose. The Roerich followers, for example, say, "If there is a son, then there must be a mother." Christians distorted the concept of the Trinity and replaced the mother with the Holy Spirit. But that wasn't the most important thing I realized during the meeting with the sectologist. For the first time in my life, I felt what the essence of a sect truly is. Almost everyone present seemed to be Orthodox, yet this gathering was, in fact, a sect. After all, when people come together for religious purposes, but not for God and not out of love for their neighbor, it can only be called a sect. And the distorted expressions on the listeners' faces revealed that, despite all the talk about God, they had gathered not for Him, but for their own theories and methods. Many journalists and human rights activists have written about RACIRS being actually a sect. RACIRS, due to its secrecy and unconventional confrontational missionary approach, was dubbed Dvorkin's sect, after its founder and ideologist. A troop of Dvorkin's international pseudo-orthodox sect and its adherents has landed on Sakhalin. Their guru claims that Sakhalin is now among the most unfavorable regions. Alexander Leonidovich Dvorkin, chairman of RACIRS, the chief sectologist of the ROC, whom former priest Golovin, for some reason, called the chief sectarian. Golovin launched an attack on Dvorkin himself, calling him and his followers Dvorkin's sect. He recalled an incident. When Dvorkin and his brethren visited Bulgar and Tatarstan, Dvorkin was paid 100,000 rubles per lecture, while his subordinates, such as Novopashin, received 50,000 rubles each. They came to give lectures 5 times. A simple calculation shows that Dvorkin earned 500,000, while his subordinates received 250,000 rubles each. The fact that RACIRS is Dvorkin's sect and that it recruits its followers from the flock of the Russian Orthodox Church has often been mentioned by people in comments under the articles about him. Human rights activist Gleb Yakunin warned that by taking the position of RACIRS and labeling independent religious groups as totalitarian sects, the Russian Orthodox Church is, in effect, describing itself. Here's the opinion of the honorary lawyer of Russia, doctor of laws, and editor-in-chief of the journal Religion and Law, Anatoly Pshelintsev. It should be emphasized that Dvorkin, in essence, created a pseudo-orthodox sect. The signs of sects that he formulated are directly applicable to his organization, the Center for Religious Studies in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus. There is a guru, the infallible Dvorkin, and his followers in various regions of the country. In reality, the Russian Orthodox Church became a victim of Dvorkin's sect. His Nazi ideology particularly resonated with the current patriarch of the ROC, Kirill, who believes himself to be the main ideologist and unrivaled leader. However, the facts we repeatedly exposed in articles on our website point to the fact that he is merely carrying out what Dvorkin skillfully imposed on him with manipulative techniques he so diligently learned from Kunith and Agard. It is not hard to notice that everyone who rejected Dvorkin's anti-Christian Nazi ideology was expelled from the ROC. Those who openly stated that Dvorkin created a sect were slandered by him, stripped of their rank, and subjected to persecution. As Dvorkin says, it's hard to find a region where there is no pseudo-orthodox sect of its own. In essence, it's hard to find a region where Dvorkin's sect hasn't destroyed people who disagree with the Nazism of RACIRS. Alongside the power seizure and the purge of the opposition within the ROC in Russia, followers from Dvorkin's totalitarian sect RACIRS were being promoted into positions of power, into the parliament and the cabinet of ministers. One of Dvorkin's close associates, Dmitry Smirnov, openly stated at conferences that only candidates whose programs declared a fight against totalitarian sects would make it into parliament. Using the resources of the ROC, which, according to the Russian constitution, is separate from the state, Dvorkin's sectarians began pushing their recruited, controlled adherents into the parliament, State Duma. Russia was the first and to this day has suffered the most from the activities of this sect. The introduction of Dvorkin's cult into power led to the adoption of laws that transformed Russia from a democratic state in the 1990s into a totalitarian regime controlled by a single sect. The state of mass repression observed in Russia today can only be compared to the period of mass terror in 1937. Key to this was the shift in legislation. Dvorkin began criticizing Russian legislation almost immediately after returning from emigration in the early 1990s, demanding the tightening of laws and restricting the rights of religious minorities. At that time, the law on freedom of conscience and religious organizations, adopted on October 1, 1990, was in force in Russia. Along with the law on freedom of religion, adopted a month later on October 25, 1990, these laws guaranteed freedom of conscience and religious activities. These were very progressive laws, and they greatly irritated Dvorkin. He publicly demanded their repeal, and contemptuously referred to them as a copy of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. This contempt for the First Amendment was inherited by Dvorkin from his Nazi teachers, Johannes Agard, who called it a neurosis, and Friedrich Hayek, who claimed it contradicted human nature. As a result of Dvorkin's active lobbying for changes to the legislation, in 1997, Russia adopted a new law on freedom of conscience and religious associations, which repealed the previous two laws and significantly restricted the rights of Russians in the realm of religious freedom. However, this was only the first step toward the destruction of freedom, democracy, and the establishment of the rule of Dvorkin's totalitarian sect in Russia. Dvorkin continued to actively tour across Russia and recruit followers into his sect. He claimed that sects constantly evolve, and this is one of the challenges in fighting them, and that a new law on freedom of conscience is necessary, since, according to him, the law he had previously lobbied for was already morally outdated at the time of its adoption. In 2002, Russia adopted the law on countering extremist activity. In 2008, significant amendments were made to this law aimed at restricting the rights and freedoms of religious organizations, allowing for their ban and liquidation if recognized as extremist. Dvorkin's army of experts and their fake expert reports repeatedly became the subject of scandals. This topic warrants an article of its own. The result of this fanatical group's efforts to destroy democracy has led the country to tragic consequences. In the same year of 2008, Dvorkin's student from the St. Tikhon's University, Alexander Konovalov, was appointed Minister of Justice. He formed an expert council on state religious evaluation, which included not only Dvorkin, but also all the most notorious experts from the RACIRS sect. Naturally, the council, which was almost entirely composed of RACIRS sect members, elected their guru as the leader. The council's powers were also significantly expanded by the Ministry of Justice, giving Dvorkin's followers the right to deliver expert opinions and label any undesired organizations and their literature as extremist. Additionally, through this council, Dvorkin gained the power to deny registration or renewal of registration for religious minorities in Russia. Then, through a series of unconstitutional changes to legislation initiated by Dvorkin's sect members in parliament, the administrative offense of extremism became a severe criminal offense. This marked the beginning of a purge of all undesirable, that is uncontrollable by Dvorkin, organizations in Russia. Having seized power, Dvorkin's sect has replaced everything and everyone. They draft laws, dictate ideology, and fight against democracy and freedom of thought, plunging society into a state of mass terror reminiscent of 1937. They are part of secret orders that govern Russia, all under Dvorkin's leadership and direct influence. It can be confidently stated that today Russia is ruled by a totalitarian sect. This is where cultism leads. And Russia, at this point, has suffered the most from the activities of this cult. To build a parallel power structure, the RACIRS sect created secret orders like the Dvorkin Brotherhood, which operates within the Dvorkin monastery. Clear evidence suggests that the leader of this closed order is Sergei Kiriyenko, the first deputy chief of staff of the Presidential Executive Office of the Russian Federation. Members of the Dvorkin Brotherhood also include current Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, Defense Minister Andrei Belousov, and many other top officials of the Kremlin elite. Kiriyenko, like Patriarch Kirill, likely believes he is cleverly exploiting the anti-cultists from Dvorkin's sect to eliminate strong competitors in the struggle for power and influence. At times, he even ceremoniously awards them medals in the Kremlin, like in the case of Alexander Novopashin, Dvorkin's right-hand man. However, in reality, those in such high positions who govern Russia are themselves under Dvorkin's manipulative influence. He controls them, skillfully exploits their weaknesses and desire to consolidate power, imposing his will and using them for his interests. Dvorkin accuses sects and cults of brainwashing, yet he himself forms a circle of fanatical followers, instilling in them a sense of divine chosenness, superiority over society, and the right to persecute and destroy anyone. Isn't that the real brainwashing? He convinces them that they are predators who have the right to judge and annihilate others. This is nothing less than a new form of Nazism, built on justifying persecution, undermining democracy, and suppressing dissent. It uses methods pioneered by Walter Koenig, who helped create Nazism and led to World War II. Koenig also cleverly played on Hitler's group's desire for dominance and power. He convinced them that these methods of persecution through dehumanization, in the best traditions of the medieval Inquisition, would grant them total power and full control over society. The Nazis embraced this. These methods proved to be highly effective, as they have today enabled someone like Dvorkin to create a system of parallel power in Russia, establishing dominance over the authorities elected by the people, with the country now governed by a sect. Yet Dvorkin's ambitions are not confined to Russia only. The international anti-cult movement under Dvorkin's leadership is the only true totalitarian destructive cult in the world. This cult aims to destroy democracy and revive Nazism. Today, its adherents actively promote this ideology through recruited agents in the media and governments of democratic countries in Europe and the United States. They are the religious zealots, carrying out the will of their guru, who oversees their activities from Moscow. Having seized power in a country with the largest nuclear arsenal, Dvorkin's sect seeks to expand its influence far beyond Russia. This is why the activities of Dvorkin's cult pose a significant threat to the free world. This organization operates like a well-planned sabotage group. They are sufficiently funded, disciplined, cohesive, and adaptable for mimicking any convenient agenda. They absorb various foundations who receive funding to influence politics. They easily adapt to all and exploit resources and opportunities to expand their influence. While the overwhelming majority of humanity is freedom-loving, values freedom, rights, and democracy, the Dvorkin sect does the opposite. It destroys fundamental human rights and freedoms to achieve the totalitarian power its leader craves. In truth, this is a sequestrum that has separated itself from the rest of healthy humanity. A sequestrum afflicted with superiority, that is, with Nazism. This is the Dvorkin's cult. As is well known, Nazism cannot exist without war or the constant imposition of an enemy image. It is simply impossible. Nazism is always war, an extermination of one group or another. If Nazis run out of enemies, they devour each other. They cannot exist without an enemy. The Dvorkin sect created the image of an enemy and actively imposed it on the Russian population in an attempt to Nazify the country. Dvorkin and his adherents promoted the narrative that religious minorities were a dangerous tool used by the US to organize coups and revolutions. Dvorkin's sect especially demonized and discredited the so-called Orange Revolution, which took place in Ukraine in 2004, initially labeling Ukrainian authorities as sectarians, and later branding all Ukrainians as sect members, Satanists, and US agents. In 2012, after the State Duma elections, Russia witnessed a wave of mass protests, including events at Bolotnaya Square in Moscow. Following these events, Russian authorities intensified a campaign for countering extremism. However, the new legislation was primarily aimed at suppressing religious minorities that the Dvorkin sect had labeled as enemies and threats to the state. This clearly demonstrates how much the Dvorkin sect had strengthened its power and control over the government. For decades, Guru Dvorkin traveled across the country, giving lectures to law enforcement representatives and establishing connections with extremism prevention departments, literally recruiting them into his own sect of anti-cultists. It must be understood that local authorities in the regions were interested in establishing contacts with a high-ranking representative of the Ministry of Justice and the ROC from Moscow, so Pastor Dvorkin's sermons were mandatory for local officials, government administration employees, and police officers, who were forced to attend these events. The problem, however, was that the attempt to tighten the screws further by strengthening the dominance of the ROC, which had by then expelled anyone who disagreed with Dvorkin's cult, risked sparking backlash in society. To pass such laws, a provocation was needed that would sway public opinion in favor of accepting restrictions on their own freedoms. Like the one when, to justify waging war against Poland, Hitler's soldiers dressed in Polish military uniforms and staged an attack on a German radio station in the town of Gliwice was required. So, on February 21, 2012, such an unexpected event actually occurred. It became known as the Pussy Riot punk group's action in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. Unimpeded, 4 women in balaclavas desecrated the ROC's main cathedral, recorded it on video, and leisurely left the scene with the footage, which was later published online. It's worth noting that the ROC's main cathedral is a well-guarded location, and its security personnel are not timid guys. For example, in 2006 they beat up the secretary of the Dutch embassy on the grounds of sudden dislike of each other. Evidently, the women in balaclava face masks did not provoke any dislike in the cathedral guards or other ROC staff, who are notorious for their tolerance toward anyone who faced them. Public outrage that followed was entirely predictable, given the extensive media coverage of the desecration of the ROC cathedral. The Pussy Riot action in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior was condemned by 70% of Russians, with 1 in 3 respondents calling for the participants to serve prison time. A significant role in shaping such public opinion and amplifying the media coverage of this event was played by Alexander Shchipkov, a high-ranking member of the RACIRS sect. Until 2011, he was an assistant to the chairman of the Federation Council, the initiator of the Russian Federation's Public Council on television, and a member of the Expert Council for State Religious Evaluation at the Ministry of Justice under Dvorkin's leadership. Like Dvorkin, Shchipkov trained under Johannes Agard. Today, Shchipkov is considered one of the main ideologists of the ROC, and, since 2016, has held the position of advisor to the chairman of the State Duma of Russia. Shchipkov, who, like Dvorkin, is credited with coining the term Totalitarian Sect, declared that the punk group's action on February 21, 2012, was a terrorist attack. The Russian Orthodox Church has been declared a Cold War, and this terrorist act is of a cold nature, without bloodshed. But given the goals set by the group manipulating Tolokonikova, Samutsevich, and Alyokina, and the results achieved, this is a terrorist attack. Female terrorists, whether actual suicide bombers or performers of a cold terrorist act, consciously sacrifice themselves for the goal they set. This is the only way to assess the behavior and actions of these women. Many have noted the psychological similarities between Yevgenia Cassis and Tolokonikova. Yevgenia Cassis was involved in the murder case of lawyer Stanislav Markelov and journalist Anastasia Babarova in 2011. It may also be added, incidentally, Alexander Shchipkov, like Dvorkin, once attended lectures by the notorious anti-cultist figure of the late 20th century, Johannes Agard. Several factions in the State Duma immediately called for a resolute response to the destructive forces glorifying anti-religious extremism, vandalism, and hooliganism, inciting hatred against the Russian Orthodox Church and other religious organizations. After which, in 2013, there followed the adoption of the law against offending the religious feelings of believers. From 1997 to 2013, offending religious feelings was considered an administrative offense. In June 2013, amendments were introduced to increase liability for offending the religious feelings of believers, including criminal penalties for public actions showing blatant disrespect for society and committed to offend the religious feelings of believers. Without the provocation by Pussy Riot and the artificially created media frenzy, such measures would have been unthinkable. If such a provocation had not existed, the RACIRS sect, closely collaborating with the FSB, would likely have organized one to achieve its goals. This is strikingly similar to a provocation orchestrated by one of Dvorkin's Nazi mentors, Johannes Agard. It was he who initiated the publication of provocative and offensive materials in the media, targeting Muslims in Europe. The tragic consequences are well known and were entirely predictable, as in the case of the Pussy Riot provocation. Just as the Reichstag fire staged by the Nazis on February 27, 1933, played a critical role in consolidating Nazi power in Germany, the action in the ROC Cathedral nominally strengthened the ROC's position but, in reality, benefited Dvorkin's sect, which clearly stood behind the organization of these events. Because the sole beneficiary of this action was Dvorkin's sect, just as with numerous other terrorist acts. Dvorkin himself, during his visit to Perm, called for letting the Pussy Riot participants go in peace. This actually points to his involvement, as he always acts this way, first staging an action, then feigning mercy, which has no impact on the punishment's outcome. The government's effort to suppress opposition activity, combined with the Dvorkin sect's goal of eliminating independent religious movements, became evident in the new anti-extremism measures proposed in 2013 and the related law toughening penalties for extremist activity, which came into force in 2014. The 2014 anti-terrorism law package introduced criminal liability for inducing, recruiting, or otherwise involving a person in extremist organizations or communities. Such vague wording criminalized actions by individuals who were not necessarily members of these groups. It also remained unclear what exactly constituted persuasion to participate if the person doing the inducing was not a member of the group. The first to come under attack were followers of unregistered religious associations, those to whom Dvorkin's counsel under the Ministry of Justice either refused to issue or renew licenses. In 2016, Russian legislation became even more perverted with the adoption of the infamous Yarovaya package. Amendments to the law on freedom of conscience and religious associations introduced strict restrictions on missionary activity. The wording of the article on missionary activity, developed by government religious experts, was taken from old drafts of the anti-sectarian movement. In essence, the law completely banned missionary activity by unregistered religious groups. Notably, law enforcement agencies began actively enforcing the new provisions almost immediately after their adoption. In 2016, dozens of individuals were convicted for illegal missionary activity. None of these cases had any connection to a terrorist threat. Every instance involved Protestants and Krishna followers. Next came yoga instructors, who were also prosecuted for missionary activity under the Yarovaya law. Dvorkin's hatred of yoga is hard to explain logically. Perhaps physical exercise is incompatible with his psychiatric condition. Yoga is the art of death, he repeatedly claimed. For a Christian, practicing yoga is a sin that requires repentance. Moreover, as many doctors say, it is unhealthy for a person to stretch their joints or bend in such ways, Dvorkin stated. His obsessive drive to ban harmless and quite beneficial yoga activities only further completes his portrait as a cult leader, convinced of his divine mission of Nazism, seeking to control everything and everyone. Of course, like any sadist, Dvorkin takes pleasure in tormenting the most defenseless. In this case, he directed his fury at people held in pretrial detention centers. In 2019, Senator Elena Mizulina appealed to Prosecutor General Yuri Chaika, requesting a review of the legality of yoga classes in Moscow's pretrial detention centers. The basis for her appeal was a letter from Alexander Dvorkin. According to Dvorkin, yoga poses could cause sexual arousal, leading to homosexuality behind bars. The most absurd part of this story is not even Dvorkin's statements, but the newspaper article published on the English version of the BBC website covering this event. It was filled with ridiculous compliments towards Dvorkin, such as US-educated Professor Dvorkin, Alexander Dvorkin, a Moscow academic. Alexander Dvorkin is an influential figure, and Professor Dvorkin. Such inappropriate content in the British BBC can only be explained with the influence exerted on the editorial board by a recruited adherent of Dvorkin's sect, the British anti-cultist Alexandra Stein. We covered this topic in detail in the article about RACIRS' influence on British media. Dvorkin's sect members in Britain, such as Alexandra Stein and Tom Sackville, are actively pushing the agenda of amending British legislation, essentially lobbying for laws similar to those that have brought Russia to its current state. For instance, Dvorkin has argued for the introduction of a criminal code article that would impose penalties for psychological abuse. In 2022, several British media outlets, including the well-known anti-cult mouthpiece Daily Mail, published Alexandra Stein's appeal, made through the Family Survival Trust, calling on the government to amend a section of the 2015 Serious Crime Act. This section criminalizes coercive controlling behavior in intimate or familial relationships, and Stein proposed extending it to apply to individuals influenced by cults. At the same time, Stein actively demonizes politicians, inciting hatred toward those she labels as cultists. Similar attempts were made by Dvorkin in Ukraine through a network of recruited RACIRS fanatics. These agents masked their state-destroying activities as a fight against totalitarian sects. The consequences of their work are detailed in the articles Europe, Open Your Eyes, and RACIRS agents in Ukraine. An attempt to provoke public outrage in Ukraine following the Russian scenario was carried out in Kiev during the summer of 2012. First, topless feminine activists with slogans like "Kill Kirill" painted on their bodies attacked the head of the ROC at Borispil Airport. Later, they cut down a cross on Maidan Nezalezhnosti in support of Pussy Riot. Throughout the year prior to these events, female activists closely collaborated with Ilya Bey, a lecturer at the Kiev Theological Academy and a student at the Hussite Theological Faculty of Charles University in Prague. Bey was a close associate of Pavel Broid, the coordinator of the All-Ukrainian Apologetics Center, who promoted Dvorkin's interests in Ukraine. Bey was described as a colleague of Broid and commissioned propaganda projects. Now think about who was truly behind these provocations. Was it not Dvorkin's sect and their greatest guru of all time? The global anti-cult network operates like an intelligence agency. It is well-organized, well-funded, and motivated by Dvorkin. It executes his orders with precision. These agents influence governmental, law enforcement, and judicial structures. Russia is a prime example of where such activity leads. With the establishment of RACIRS in Russia, the country's freedom index began to decline, and everything is heading toward a complete Iron Curtain with an internet ban, exit visas, and more. The free, democratic Russia of the 1990s is a thing of the past because of the actions of Dvorkin and his sect. If we examine the decline in freedom and human rights in Russia, it is easy to trace the connection between the expansion of Dvorkin's sect's power and influence, along with the initiatives carried out by its adherents, and the destruction of human rights in the country. At the very beginning of this international criminal killer sect's activities, they orchestrated the events in Waco in 1993. Back then, the provocation resulted in the deaths of 83 people, including 25 children. What's happening in Russia now is a direct consequence of those events. None of the organizers of this gas chamber of torture, which employed the sophisticated psycho-warfare techniques of Russian anti-cultist Igor Smirnov, were ever held accountable. Among the numerous religious groups targeted by Dvorkin's sect, almost none are actively involved in political processes or impose their beliefs on society. The only group imposing its will, using media violence and administrative resources, is Dvorkin's cult. They seek to control both politicians and public consciousness through manipulation. They are also the sole beneficiaries of numerous terrorist acts. It is enough to look at how these sectarians became active after the terrorist attack at Crocus City Hall, as well as incidents like school shootings and mass shootings. The only ones who benefit from such horrific events are Dvorkin's sect. Given their special expertise in orchestrating media violence, these informational terror attacks are carried out using mass psychological conditioning techniques that Dvorkin inherited from Walter Kunneth. After any informational terror attack, the entire network of Dvorkin's followers is activated to spread the story in the media and use the frenzy against politicians uncontrollable by RACIRS. All members of this network claim to have no connections to one another, yet they act in absolute synchrony and coordination. If you examine the biographies of the key figures in Dvorkin's sect, you won't find sane people there. There are either former drug addicts like Dvorkin himself, or rapists, pedophiles, anti-Semites, and deprogrammers who torment innocent people by arranging media terror and persecution. What unites them all is their sick belief in their superiority over others. Isn't it Nazism? Their so-called fight against cults is merely a convenient cover for advancing the geopolitical interests of their guru and leader, Alexander Dvorkin.